What happens when young women not only fail to live up to ideal or perfect genitals, but come to embody our fears around infected, leaky, and messy vaginas? We're about to go there in my MPhil dissertation, Embodying Infection: How Young Women Experience Chronic Yeast Infections. 3 out of 4 women will experience at least one yeast infection in their lifetime. If you've heard of a yeast infection or if you've had one, you've probably been told that they're no big deal, very common, and nothing that can't be treated in a few days. What you probably haven't heard is that for 5 to 10% of women, yeast infections can become recurrent or chronic, presenting for years and causing immense distress. These infections are notoriously difficult to treat and remain understudied from both a medical and sociological perspective. And while anybody of any gender can suffer from chronic yeast infections, statistics and scholarship, including my own, focus on cis women's experiences. Now, what exactly are chronic yeast infections? Chronic yeast infections, also known as thrush, are a fungal infection of the vulva and/or vagina. Symptoms include constant itchiness, burning, redness, pain, and a weird discharge, often unflatteringly referred to as resembling cottage cheese. Recurrence ranges from once a month to bi-weekly to never truly going away, and in the words of my participants, they're described as being debilitating, irritating, embarrassing, annoying, and draining. And as one participant put the experience, "It won't get better, it's constant, whatever I do, it will never go away." For this presentation, I'm going to start off by providing some context for the study before delving into my findings and wrapping up with some discussion. So, who am I? My name is Victoria Ford, and I'm an MPhil student in Health, Medicine, and Society who last week graduated from the University of Cambridge. I myself have suffered with chronic yeast infections for the past 5 years, and I'm the founder of Medical Her Story, a not-for-profit dedicated to raising awareness on gender health and equity through storytelling. You can live tweet me at Medical Her Story and find out more about me there. For my MPhil dissertation, I interviewed 6 women living with chronic yeast infections. Since these infections can present differently across women, I chose not to impose a strict definition of chronic yeast infections onto my participants, but instead I welcomed anyone to participate who self-identified as having experienced a chronic yeast infection, which was described as not going away or that kept coming back. So in order to capture a range of experiences, my study did not require that women had sought out medical care or received an official diagnosis. And in the end, the women I spoke with were aged between 20 and 23. 4 were Canadian, 1 was American, and 1 was British. And on average, they'd been living with chronic yeast infections for 2.5 years. And at the time of speaking, 2 had recovered while 4 had not. For this study, I explore how women's experiences of chronic yeast infections are understood, embodied, and problematized within social constructs of gender, pathology, and normalcy. I compare how chronic yeast infections highlight attention within women's health. On the one hand, social discourses pathologize and stigmatize women's genitals and bodily fluids as dangerous, disgusting, and potentially diseased. This stereotype of the leaky female body frames women's genitals as smelly, dirty, and out of control, even when they are not infected. On the other hand, women's pain and discomfort is often normalized, overlooked, and dismissed within medical settings. As a result, yeast infections, like many other conditions, are naturalized as something that just happens to women and that they have to deal with. This tension is further exacerbated for young women beginning to navigate their bodies, relationships, and medical care. I argue that young women with chronic yeast infections both problematize and normalize their experience due to a lack of effective medical treatment, dismissal of their condition, and societal discourses tethering women's gender and genitals to infection. As a result, the onus of care and cure gets placed onto the individual to be addressed alone, while obscuring larger gender and social dynamics impacting this experience. So, to further explain how I got to these conclusions, I'm going to allow my participants' voices to be heard throughout the findings section. After doing a thematic analysis of the interviews, I came across 4 main themes: infected and unhappy bodies, gender/genital inequality, medics and self-management, and finally, normalizing the abnormal. The women I spoke with articulated an antagonistic relationship between themselves, their infection, and their symptomatic genitals. Some interviewees viewed this experience as a malfunction, while others viewed it as an outside invasion. Regardless of the infection's alleged origins, the interviewees understood their experience as an active battle between 2 agents, themselves and their infected body. The woman I spoke with highlighted that there was already a big stigma around vaginas being seen as gross, having discharge and odors, and that within popular culture, the idea of a perfect vagina was fresh, clean, and smelled like flowers. Therefore, a chronically infected vagina was literally the complete opposite of this ideal. As a result, interviewees feared that others would find out about their infected status and view them as undesirable, as reflected in one quote by the participant. I don't want to be associated with she's really pretty and she's really nice and she's great, but I don't know if I would ever want to have sex with her, just because she constantly has a vagina that has weird discharge and itches and burns. That's not me at all. I'm my own person. I am so much more. So this quote highlights a tension between the self and the not me, in this case the infected genitals. This language of the not me was further emphasized in the language young women use to describe and personify their vaginas and vulvas. They describe them as being unhappy, easily upset, and pissed. And although the infections were relatively localized, the women described the infections as spraying around their bodies and overtaking their mental health as they felt that their bodies were working against them. Due to the stigma around infected genitals, women tried to conceal their infection, and often didn't discuss them even with their close female friends. However, the majority ultimately did open up to their long-term partners. Although the interviewees said that their partners were supportive and shared the consequences of a less active sex life, they argued that men could not share their shame. While the women were unsure what caused their yeast infections, they suspected that their partners might be passing the infection back and forth. One participant labeled this the Uni Problem. She stated, "I don't know the science of passing back and forth or how that would happen, but it seems like you could get in an endless cycle. By the time I was realizing, oh, this is a Uni problem. It's not just me, it's both of us. We had broken up." However, despite women trying to implicate their partners in this process, they found that yeast infections were still rendered a women's problem due to anatomy and gender inequalities. They stated that vaginas were constructed as mysterious and prone to infection, while penises, on the other hand, were simple and easy to manage. Therefore, the women stressed that this was just one example of many, reflecting how women's health was not taken seriously. In hopes of finding a cure, the women I spoke with visited a range of practitioners, including gynecologists, dermatologists, infectious disease specialists, and pharmacists. They were given a range of antifungal treatments, probiotics, different forms of birth control, and a range of lifestyle factors. The women stated that they often felt blamed and stigmatized in these encounters by being asked questions like, "Are you changing your underwear?" They also reported feeling violated after invasive tests, being patronized and dismissed. And as a result, most of the women turned to self-medication by altering their diet, sexual practices, and using a range of pharmaceutical products. They stated that they felt that nobody really cared and were being told that women shouldn't discuss this topic. They stated that yeast was being framed as just a part of life, that it was normal, and that they should stop complaining. One participant summed this up in a nice quote, stating, "The doctor just kind of disregarded the whole thing and was like, 'All right, take off your pants, I'll do the swab.' Really like, doesn't matter, no one cares, get in, get out." After failing to find a cure and losing faith in the medical system, the women turned their efforts from eradication to normalization. The women described the so-called rise and fall of chronic yeast infections as becoming their new normal, as normal had been distorted. They stated that chronic yeast infections became a part of their identity, or were a personality trait. They compared it vividly to being a parasite, a demon, or a catchy song that enters your body and does not leave. Others invoked metaphors of symbiosis and a shared body as they formed new relationship between themselves and their infection. As one woman framed it, this was a me problem. Every symptom was a me problem. Pain, discomfort, discharge, itchiness, it was affecting me. It's a me problem in a good way. It's a problem, I wish it wasn't happening, but at least it's just happening to me. So this quote highlights how women were able to reframe their experience as a me problem, and that this was facilitated by a lack of medical treatment and societal discourses that dismissed women's discomfort and encouraged them to deal with it alone. And while the chronicity of yeast infections fostered an active struggle between women and their infections, it also opened up new understandings of the self as embodying infection. The women I interviewed had diverse symptoms, perceived etiologies, and management strategies. However, a common illness narrative appeared regarding initial infection, problematization, and subsequent normalization. This narrative included women experiencing their genitals as infected and antagonistic, confronting gender discourses that infection was a women's problem, and navigating healthcare where chronic yeast infections did not fit neatly or have a cure. Over time, the women normalized and embodied their infections. Young women with chronic yeast infections straddle conflicting realities, as their infections are considered benign, trivial, and normal, yet cause considerable distress. Without denying that yeast infections are normal, as in biologically common, I want to argue that this normalcy is reinforced by gender discourses tethering women and their genitals to pain and infection. Because if societal discourses stigmatize women's normal genitals as pathological, then women's genital pathologies become normalized by physicians, intimate partners, and women themselves. And this normalization has consequences for women's medical care, relationships, and identity. My interviews revealed that women with chronic yeast infections problematize their experience in several ways. In this section of the discussion, I want to group these themes into three phases and propose a theoretical model for understanding how women both problematize and normalize their infections. These are the not me problem, the Uni problem, and the me problem. I'm suggesting that these phases represent three sequential shifts in experiencing and embodying infection. However, these models of problematization do not replace one another, but instead they overlap to facilitate each subsequent phase. I maintain that the young woman's eventual normalization of chronic yeast infections is not a desirable outcome, but is the result of coping with a condition that has received very little medical and social urgency due to its alleged normalcy and links to gender discourses. In the first phase of problematization, women recognize their fungal infection and subsequently their symptomatic genitals and stereotypes associated with a problematic vagina as not me. The not me has been used in previous literature to refer to the environments, bacteria, and viruses in which we interact with but do not necessarily identify as ourselves. In this case, the women experienced a rupture between themselves and their infection, leading them to resent their bodies, which were seen as working against them. Unlike previous accounts of the vagina, which represented as passive, women with chronic yeast infections personified their genitals as an attacking force. As a result, the women attempted various measures to eradicate their infection as well as conceal it from others. After failing to eradicate the not me on their own, the women attempted to relieve their suffering by framing chronic yeast infections as a Uni problem between themselves and their partners or doctors. However, gender expectations and medical apathy prevented this exchange as women's vaginal discomfort was normalized. Although men are able to leak, seep, and ooze and sometimes can suffer from fungal overgrowth, they do not become associated with shame and infection. In contrast, women are seen as a leaky body and therefore the ideal breeding ground for fungus. As a result, women's yeast infections are seen not only as natural, but normal and inevitable. Since yeast infections are not recognized as being sexually transmitted, but that they are the result of an internal imbalanced microbiome, women are prevented from sharing shame or blame with their partners. Moreover, this normal association of women's genitals and infection influences medical encounters and potentially how doctors perceive and treat women's ailments. The majority of women in this study sought out medical care in the hopes of gaining relief, yet reported disappointment that yeast infections did not have an effective cure or fit neatly within the medical system. This ambiguous status of chronic yeast infections was not only individual but structural. Interviewees reported that their chronic yeast infections were often overlooked in medical care and they did not feel seen, but instead were dismissed as being normal and therefore not recognized as suffering. And while the participants visited a range of practitioners, both male and female, across a range of specialties and within the US, UK, and Canada, such perceptions of doctors' attitudes persisted. Further, even those who avoided medical care did so within the context of assuming that physicians would dismiss and minimize their condition. As a result, women reported that yeast infections felt like something they must deal with all alone. In the final phase of problematization, young women came to normalize and embody their chronic yeast infections as a me problem. After failing to eradicate the not me and being unable to share their distress in the Uni problem, interviewees resolved to normalize their discomfort. Societal and medical perception that yeast infections were normal and non threatening reinforced that individuals should keep silent on these issues and address them privately. Therefore, this final phase is not inevitable, but the result of chronic yeast infections lacking a cure, being dismissed as normal and unworthy of serious attention. The young women transitioned from seeing their chronic yeast infections as something which happened to them to a part of them. Although chronic yeast infections are often viewed as a minor or mundane issue, my interviews surprisingly revealed that the women invoked normalization strategies that we often see with more serious health conditions. Due to the chronicity of the infections, the women began to form a relationship with the not me, invoking analogies of a shared body, symbiosis, or coexistence. This final phase was not necessarily a positive resolution, and conflict often endured, as women's symptoms did not subside, but they instead became habituated to embodying discomfort. Within previous literature, normalization has been presented as a way for individuals to cope with the stigma of chronic illness as well as to mitigate negative self-perceptions. Without negating the power of normalization to aid certain individuals, it is important to recognize that normalization is a gendered process which can be used to dismiss women's suffering. Although some of the interviewees described the me problem as positive or desirable for it aided in concealing their ailment, I argue that this normalization confines chronic yeast infections to women's pathologized genitals while obscuring larger societal and gender discourses at play. While pathologization and normalization are usually discussed as opposites, women with chronic yeast infections came to embody both these discourses, which influenced how they could cope. On the one hand, women with chronic yeast infections are stigmatized as they confirm social anxieties around infected and undesirable genitals. Yet, on the other hand, discourses that vaginas are already gross and potentially diseased render women's infections and subsequently suffering as both normal and inevitable. Societal discourses stigmatize vaginas as pathological, and therefore women's genital pathologies become normalized. Therefore, examining these three phases offers one model for understanding how young women with chronic yeast infections embody this paradox of a normal problem, as societal and gender discourses are enacted onto the body and shape how suffering is understood, experienced, and treated. While discourses of normalization might be empowering for some individuals in some conditions, they may disempower others, especially women and other groups who have historically had their pain and discomfort dismissed. Further, normalization can obscure broader gender and social structures by assigning shame and responsibility onto individuals. The model of problematization that I present points to some implications for clinical practice and biomedical research. Chronic yeast infections were identified by the young women as the first time they became aware that their bodies could go wrong or malfunction. Therefore, chronic yeast infections were also the first time that these young women came into contact with medical professions concerning the leaky female body. These encounters, therefore, are a key site of intervention as they leave a lasting impact on how young women see their bodies, health, and medical practitioners. Normalization has dangerous consequences, as women might avoid medical care due to the discourses that vaginal discomfort is normal and should be addressed privately, or they might avoid medical care after a negative first experience. As a result, disempowered young women might take it upon themselves to perform risky bodywork and hygienic practices to mitigate their chronic discomfort and attempt to conform to the fresh and clean ideal of femininity while actually exacerbating their condition. Moreover, if chronic yeast infections are considered trivial or inevitable, this normalization could be used to justify a lack of further clinical research. Until there's an effective cure, young women living with chronic yeast infections will continue to navigate these discourses. In conclusion, considering the prevalence of acute and chronic yeast infections, there is an opportunity here for researchers, clinicians, and activists to disrupt the naturalized association between women and infection by destigmatizing vaginas without normalizing women's suffering. I'd love to keep this conversation going. Please do reach out to me through my social media at Medical Her Story, through my email, and definitely check out Medical Her Story to hear other women breaking down the taboos surrounding our bodies.